YouTube page. And I will be introducing Francisco, who is our speaker for today. So Francisco Meno Ugarte was born in San Salvador in 1974. Due to the war in 1981, his family had to flee El Salvador. He lived in several countries in Central America and North America, including the US and Mexico. After 13 years and once the war ended, his family returned to El Salvador. Francisco studied business at Universidad Albert Einstein. He has two sisters and is married to Veronica Ayala. Francisco is the executive director at Chris Paz. He has worked at Chris Paz since 2009. And before we start today's presentation, Mary Sue, who is the director of campus ministry, will be reading a short reflection.
So today we know that this is the anniversary of St. Archbishop Oscar Romero's assassination. Social justice is not just a law that orders to share. Seen in a Christian manner, it is an internal attitude like that of Christ, who being rich became poor so as to share his love with the poor. I hope this call of the church will not further harden the hearts of oligarchs, but will move them to conversion. Let them share what they are and have. Let them not keep silencing with violence the voice of those who offer this invitation. Let them not keep killing those of us who are trying to achieve a more just sharing of power and wealth in our country. I speak in the first person because this week I received notice that I am on the list of those to be eliminated next week. But let it be known that no one can any longer kill in the voice of justice. So let's just take 30 seconds in silence and in gratitude to remember the life of Archbishop Oscar Romero and all the martyrs of El Salvador. Let us also pray for those around the world who are killed from political oppression, particularly those whose governments are backed by the US. So we will say a strong amen in gratitude for those who live and continue to struggle for full life for all God's people. Amen.
And so now we're going to pass things over to Francisco.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to thank you for the invitation to be able to share a little bit about Monsignor Romero, and obviously on a very special day, a day that is, we commemorate his death, but what we really do is celebrate his life and his legacy. So I want to share with you some thoughts of how Monsignor Romero has affected, mostly in the way that I've seen our work, which is hosting groups that normally come from the United States. Hopefully we can have a space for questions, I suppose, later. But let me share this with you. So here we go. Second place. All right, so The way that I've titled this and structured this is Monsignor Romero, a saint of solidarity. I truly believe that in our context, Monsignor Romero has become a saint that represents solidarity in the way that he lived his life, and he connected with so many people, and especially the most vulnerable. So in El Salvador and around El Salvador, we do consider him to be the saint of solidarity. Just as it was mentioned earlier, just a few seconds ago, on March 24th, 1980, Monsignor Romero was assassinated while he was celebrating Mass. And I think it's important to ask ourselves, why was he assassinated? And the answer is, unfortunately or fortunately, very simple. Monsignor Romero was assassinated for his unwavering commitment to solidarity, specifically to the impoverished and oppressed. He was assassinated because of his commitment to the preferential option for the poor. In the 11 years or so that I've been working as executive director for CRISPAS, I've witnessed how the example of the Salvadoran martyrs, especially Monsignor Romero's, has shaken and inspired the lives of so many people that have come to El Salvador. I would like to suggest that what Monsignor Romero offers us today is a powerful message of profound and radical hope. But what does radical hope mean? What does it look like? And what does it feel like? The people of El Salvador have helped me answer these questions. I've had the great fortune to sit in front of radical hope. That is, I've had the honor of meeting a courageous group of women called Comadres, the Committee of Mothers of the Disappeared. This committee was formed by mothers whose sons and daughters had been captured by El Salvador's death squads during the 70s and 80s that were trained by the United States government, specifically the Army. To this day, the majority of them have never been found. Their children were being persecuted for publicly protesting the injustices of the military regime backed by the United States. These mothers encountered lies, violence, and death as they searched for their sons and daughters. Some of them ended up being tortured themselves. Mother Alicia was one of the founders of Comadres. She lost 2 sons. One was 16 years old, the other only 12. Her daughter was raped and tortured, and she herself was captured when she was 5 months pregnant. The torture they put her through was so violent that she ended up having a miscarriage in prison. They kept on denouncing these injustices and accompanying other mothers with a radical, persistent hope that they would be heard and that they would find their children. What made their hope radical wasn't just what they hoped for. It wasn't what inspired it, what grounded it, or what enabled them to believe that things could be different. Certainly what inspired them and what inspires anyone who has hope is something we feel in ourselves, in our humanity. But at the same time, it's more than that. It is what enables us to hope when humanly speaking, there's no reason to hope. Radical hope opens us to what Monsignor Romero would call the spirit that acts in and through our humanity. And so for these mothers, radical hope was never about doing something that was sure to have results. It was about not giving up. It was about doing what was right simply because it was right. Hope in such desperate situations can only be a radical hope. Monsignor Romero was close to people like these mothers, people who made him more human. He came to know and see the unjust reality that most people in El Salvador were living with. Under Monsignor Romero, the vision of the Archdiocese started to change and to have a preferential option for the poor. The Archdiocese, through tutela legal, a legal office in the Archdiocese, would unveil the truth, gathering information and analyzing the violation of human rights of those responsible for those violations. Monsignor Romero intentionally, purposefully, and passionately addressed the specific causes of the injustice existing at the time. and that meant challenging the status quo. But how can one sustain this radical hope and prophetic action? Here, Monsignor Romero would remind us of the need for contemplation. We nurture our radical hope in our spirituality, in our prayer life, in what we call the awareness of the Spirit that we feel in private meditation or in community gatherings and prayer. We need contemplation to sustain both radical hope and action. The ability to hope and keep acting when the opposition is overwhelming and nothing seems to change. This comes out of faith, out of what we feel inside of ourselves, together with others in community. Such spirit energy leads us to action. And that may require that we make political choices and take positions. This is something that's difficult to do nowadays when we're told not to mix politics with religion, or when we confuse disagreeing with being disagreeable. To follow the example of Monsignor Romero and so many other Salvadoran martyrs is to commit ourselves to a path of radical hope and action. It is a path in which our action will be sustained by our spirituality, and our spirituality will call us to further action. The memory of Monsignor Romero fills our history with light, but these memories can also be dangerous in the sense that they call upon us, or better yet, they demand of us that we carry on. Monsignor Romero once said that the word of God is like the light of the sun. It illuminates beautiful things, but also things that we would rather not see. Monsignor Romero's message and teachings should do exactly the same thing. We need to be careful not to put Monsignor Romero behind velvet ropes or on a shrine. His message needs to continue to be uncomfortable so it can shed light on the injustices around us. When we remember what people have lived and died for, we find ourselves empowered to follow their example and to hope even when there seems no reason to hope, and therefore respond. When we respond to issues such as immigration, racial discrimination, and climate change, we are responding to those who cry out for justice. It is an example of how Christians are to follow Jesus in today's world, a world in which millions of people are suffering. As Christians, we must recognize that we live in a world filled with numerous groups and communities facing systematic oppression, and we must act. We have to be willing to identify and engage the complex realities within our world that create such problems. To commit ourselves to radical hope and action is a matter of who we are as disciples and followers of Jesus. It's not a liberal cause or a populist agenda or a mainstream fad. It is a deeply spiritual practice. The dangerous memory of Monsignor Romero and so many martyrs of El Salvador transcends our borders and calls us to move forward. So I want to, one second. I want to use this as an introduction to kind of set some context to Monsignor Romero. I want to share a few additional kind of points or areas of Monsignor Romero. I think that whenever I speak to groups that come to El Salvador or are connected to El Salvador and are learning about Monsignor Romero, one of the first things that I normally say to groups is that it's important to understand the context in which Monsignor Romero lived and where his memory continues to be alive. And something that could sound shocking to some, but it's unfortunately real, is that Monsignor Romero is at the same time, one of the most loved Salvadorans, but also one of the most hated Salvadorans. And this is an important reminder, and it shows us how much more work we have to do with regards to his memory, with regards to his legacy. It's important to remember that Salvadorans were the ones who killed Monsignor Romero. His canonization happened recently. His beatification happened a few years before that. And I'll say that it's probably one of the days that I felt the proudest to be a Salvadoran. Not so much because a Salvadoran person was being beatified and then eventually canonized, but because Monsignor Romero had become this universal figure, and this was a recognition of how El Salvador was sharing him with the rest of the world, and that recognition of being shared with the rest of the world. So for us, that was extremely important. But to kind of go back to the point that I was making, the church that's within the parish where he celebrated Mass on a regular basis, and where he was killed on a day like today, the Mass takes place is in a chapel, but the parish church, which is only maybe a 5-minute ride from there, was called the Resurrection Parish. And when Monsignor Romero was canonized, the name of that church was changed to Saint Romero Church. And nearly 50% of the parishioners decided not to continue going to that church because that church now had the name of Oscar Romero. So I'm pointing these things out because I want you to understand that talking about Monsignor Romero and following the work that he did and trying to follow in his footsteps to a certain degree is not something that is at the finish line. We are not done with his work at all, and he needs to continue to be present and be uncomfortable because there's still a lot of injustices, and his message and his history is still one that is very polarizing in El Salvador. So I wanted to kind of share that with you, which is a reason for hope, a reason for us to continue working. It's also a painful reminder of just where people are in terms of how they understand or how they live their reality. Yeah, I want to see if there are any questions at this point before I continue. If there's anything that needs to be elaborated a little more, I'll just pause for a few seconds, see if there are any questions.
Someone, Sarah in the chat said, could you speak a little more about why Romero isn't as well liked by some?
He challenged the status quo in a very specific way, and he denounced the injustices that happened at the time. Monsignor Romero was brought in as someone that was going to be safe for the church, someone who was not going to cause any problems. But people had not realized that Monsignor Romero had been going through a process. He was always a good person. He did not. There's this notion that Rutilio Grande's death transformed him, and that was to a certain degree the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't the conversion point. He did not change. What changed around him was the reality, and he just understood that he had to respond to that reality. But this meant challenging interests in El Salvador. There's still this notion that is unfortunately very present in our society, that argues that Monsignor Romero was killed because he got involved in politics and because he was supporting the guerrilla movement, the leftists, and he got what he deserved. The day of the beatification, I shared that really, to share with you, it's difficult for me to share the immense pride that I felt that day. It was probably, I would say, one of the happiest days that I can remember in my life. But that same day, I read in circles of friends and people that I know in Facebook, social media. So granted, but very strongly, this person wrote, Monsignor Romero is the worst thing that has happened to El Salvador. And that was that same day, right? So there is this idea that has been told over decades that he got involved in politics, and that's something that priests should not do. And he got what he deserved because he got involved in that. This is also said about the Jesuits. The Jesuits also, the UCA, it's the same message. Does that somewhat answer the question? Yeah, we live in a very conservative country and very polarizing country, and just like I said, people love Monsignor Romero. There are people who just hate him to this day. And the one thing I will say is that one of the reasons that hate has kind of been present is that the left has taken him as a flag. And that is something Monsignor Romero, I believe, would not agree with, but they have taken him as a flag of honor, and they assume that he would be representing them. And on the other side, people assume that yes, Monsignor Romero would be representing them. So that has contributed to that polarization.
Also, John mentioned in the chat, here's an excerpt from a poem I found by Pedro Casaldoliga. This morning, we are once again moving in testimony. Saint Romero of the Americas, our pastor and martyr. Romero of a peace almost impossible on this earth in war. Romero, a resident flower of hope, unscathed in all the continent. Romero of the Latin America resurrection. And then he put in parentheses, translation my own. And he says, so one question, where do you find hope in El Salvador today? And who specifically does Romero continue to inspire? And who finds his memory to be divisive even after his canonization?
I find hope in the people, and that's a really easy answer. That's the same reason where that frustrates me as well. Talking about the people that are divisive or find his memory divisive. So I find hope in people. I am fortunate to work with people who are very courageous, people who live out solidarity in the purest form. I shared in the beginning of my presentation, Mother Alicia. Mother Alicia was one of those mothers who was just so full of faith, so full of hope. Even with everything that had happened in her life, she still moved forward with an unbreakable faith and an unbreakable hope for a better future. So people like her, and I've had the great fortune of meeting many people like her, are without a doubt an endless source of hope. And even when I feel burned out, tired, these memories of these people, Mother Alicia unfortunately passed away, but her memory and her warmth is something that stays with me and continues to remind me of how important it is to not lose hope. I've never had to go through anything like what she went through and other women. So people like her, for sure. The memory is divisive because it challenges the status quo, and it's basically that, as easy or simple as that answer may may sound, it challenges the status quo, and it challenged the status quo that was very much in place in a very protected way in the 70s and the 80s when Monsignor Romero was alive. So his message is divisive, and kind of going back to my previous answer, because the left has manipulated his image as well. So there are, in a country that went to war with each other, so keep that in mind. That it's important not to just look at his image in understanding what a great man he was. Keep in mind this: after he died, we went to a war. We fired bullets at each other. That's how strongly we disagreed with each other. So in that context, people have very personal reasons to be on one side or the other. And when people falsely attach to the image of Monsignor Romero, those other people react to it in a very polarizing way. Because one of the things that unfortunately happened in our country right after the peace accords were signed is the amnesty law. The amnesty law eliminated two things that I think are very important in a society: justice and the truth. So I believe truth is more important than justice. Don't get me wrong, justice is important, but the truth is very important. And that process of discovering the truth of so many things that went on in our country, and specifically in the case of Monsignor Romero, discovering his truth has not been given any opportunity. So the one thing I will say is that the church, those conservative sectors of the church, are happy with a Salvadoran saint. That what they are saying is, let's just celebrate that we have a saint. Let's not pay attention to why he became a saint. Let's just focus on the fact that we now have a Salvadoran saint.
So we have another question in the chat by Shyla, and they wrote, "It sounds like this response to the figure of Monsignor Romero demonstrates the troubling personal and social reckoning that goes on in the aftermath of political upheaval and distress. Can you speak on how the past is thought of today and what kind of healing is being done to reckon with the past?"
Well, there's zero healing. Most of us know the history of our planet in some way or another, and one of those parts of history that we know, I would say, to a certain degree, well, is what happened during the Second World War. Right, we had this tremendous genocide that happened, the Holocaust, and something that happened after that was extremely important, which was the Nuremberg Trials. This was instrumental in bringing people to justice and discovering the truth. In El Salvador, we had an event that was similar in nature in terms of how destructive it was and how violent it was. And we went from that to pretending like it did not happen. We did not have that space that the Nuremberg trials kind of created for people. So if you add that along with the fact that we did not have any type of psychological accompaniment or any type of policies that included these individuals who had been going at each other in a very violent way, we haven't been able to deal with this. So there hasn't been any type of reconciliation, and the victims are living knowing that the victimizers are out there, going to the beach, going out to have dinner with their families, going to the movies, obviously when it's not the pandemic, but they're out just living their normal life. This is very traumatic, and it's twice as traumatic when first the trauma of going through that event, and then secondly the trauma of knowing that this individual is still out there. So one of the things that we do as kind of our work is talk about exactly that, the post-war era, and how, in my opinion, it could be seen as something worse than the war itself. The war is very clear kind of what's happening, but the mess that's left behind, and this also this assumption that when people go to war, or when countries go to war, or however you want to look at this, you have like two parties that are involved, the good guys and the bad guys. That's not how wars work. We have a tremendous amount of the civilian population that has no interest in dealing with these differences in a violent way affected. So there has been no social reconciliation whatsoever. So no healing has been done yet. And one of the things that happens with these wounds, psychological wounds, is not that time heals them. It's that they get worked out in different ways. And we see this being manifested in very violent ways that you hear about in El Salvador, about El Salvador. I can see there's someone's typing a question, but meanwhile, I will say that there is a large number of people who are on the side that love Monsignor Romero, and his teachings continue to be present today. And I think the challenge that we have is making sure that we bring his message, his legacy to respond to today's injustices. One of the challenges that we are facing as a society and as people who have followed Monsignor Romero is that there is a clear tendency to put Monsignor Romero behind velvet ropes. And any of you who have been to El Salvador and have been to the Hospitalito where he was murdered, it's a very small chapel for those who haven't been there. It's a very small chapel, and one could respectfully go up to the altar, and many people would touch the area where he fell after he was shot. People could go up and hold hands and pray. Once the beatification process began, and once the canonization was in gear and everything happened, you began to see how that space was cordoned off, and how it was little by little off to the public. And one of the things that was very important, and is very important about Monsignor Romero, is that he was someone who we could touch in his pictures and images, and people who knew him. He was with the people. He wasn't this sage on the stage. He wasn't this priest that conducted himself from behind the pulpit. So this attempt to remove him from the people and put him up on a pedestal is something that we have to be very careful with, especially when we talk about him with future generations and younger generations.
Shiloh wrote back, "Thank you. I'm familiar with some art projects to memorialize and revisit the past in Colombia and Argentina, but I don't hear much about El Salvador." And then John TD said, "I'm headed to celebrate a mass in a few minutes in honor of San Oscar Romero. Know that we pray in solidarity with you and Chris Paz for Francisco. And thanks so much for your words today, and resonate with your commitment to solidarity."
Yeah, thank you.
We have one more question, looks like, from Chris. And Chris wrote, "What are some key messages of his teachings that you feel most resonate with people working for justice today in El Salvador or globally?"
I think there are two, and I think that's a really good question. Monsignor Romero, I believe, was very clear on telling people that there's this notion that we shouldn't mix politics with our faith, right? And I think Monsignor Romero was a person who said that no, we need to make sure that our faith is connected to how we live out politics, and not in the sense of ideological politics, but understanding that we live in a world that's driven by policy. So we have education policy, you know, we have water policy, we have policies that are economic that could impact or favor a few or impact the most vulnerable. So in a world that's driven by so much policy, our faith cannot be removed from that. We can't just look at our faith as this jacket that we put on Sundays for an hour when we go to mass, and then remove it once we get back, and live a life that's separate from how we're supposed to live our faith. So Monsignor Romero was very key in pushing that idea of making sure that we choose people, policymakers that are creating more humane policies, that are creating policies that favor the vast majority of people. So I would say that that's one message, because there's, again, a clear message in different sectors saying that we shouldn't mix religion or our faith with politics. And Monsignor Romero was against that idea. But I do want to reiterate, he wasn't saying to vote for a specific political party, or switch from being liberal to conservative or vice versa. It was just making sure that we understood that we are in a world that's driven by policy, and we cannot remove ourselves and our faith or who we are in that. The second is that Monsignor Romero is a clear example of reevaluating where he stands, or where he stood with regards to situations that affected us. There was something that he would in practice do, and that could be translated to the fact that in light of new information that he would receive, he would be forced to change his conclusions. And I think this is something that we need to constantly be engaged in this attitude of going out, encountering people to be able to get information, to be able to obtain as much knowledge from different individuals and learn from them, and then evaluate where we are with certain conclusions, and understand that in light of new information, sometimes we need to be forced to change those conclusions, to arrive at a conclusion in a different way. So I think that those two things, being open, sometimes we tend to have a very firm position on something, and we defend it, but I think we need to be humble enough, and Monsignor Romero was able to do this. He was very humble to understand that, he would say, in light of this new information, I am forced to change my conclusion. So I would say those two elements are important in looking at where we are in this world, and how things are affecting us. And this isn't just specific about El Salvador. I think it applies globally. You're welcome. You're welcome, Chris.
Charlo wrote a question in the chat, and the question is, do you have any thoughts on what is known as the Prayer of Oscar Romero, which I understand was written in his honor and not by him?
Yeah, it was written by a bishop from Detroit, Ken Utner, and it's called the Romero Prayer, and I think it's one of my favorite not only prayers, but I think just references to Monsignor. But I consider it to be a guide of how we should live our lives. I think it's very important. I use it for meditation purposes. I use it for prayer. I use it for various reasons, and it helps me understand how to live my life in a better way. There are different parts, and the interesting thing about that prayer is that depending on where you are on your life, there are different parts that speak to you differently when you read it over and over again. It speaks to me in different ways every time I read it, and I do think it is it's a roadmap to how to live in today's world. I think so. It's yeah, and I love it. Yeah, yeah. So I see here that Sarah is asking about Crispas. Crispas is a faith-based organization that was founded in 1984. So we have been here for a few decades now, over 35 years, and we started by bringing groups from the United States to learn about Salvador. And something that we were very critical about from the very beginning was making sure that people did not come down with this mentality to fix things. And to this day, we continue to be very critical with those who come down here thinking that they have the power to fix kind of the issues of El Salvador. We understand that people that come and build homes and build schools come down here with their heart in the right place, but essentially what they're doing is coming down here with power to give, and people in El Salvador are just waiting for them to come with no power and receive. So we're trying to switch. What we do is we switch this very vertical structure to a horizontal structure where there are still power dynamics, but solidarity begins to take a different part of this relationship, and there is an exchange that is not only measured in economic terms. So from the very beginning, we did a few things. One of them was to shed light on U.S. foreign policy, making sure people understood what U.S. foreign policy and the military aid that the U.S. was sending to El Salvador was doing to the Salvadoran people. I mentioned briefly that we have this idea that when a war happens, it normally happens between the two parties involved, and we wanted to let people know with their own eyes what it was doing to the civilian population, learning about the massacres of El Mozote, where 700 people were killed, specifically in El Mozote and the surrounding villages. On that same operation, over 1,000 people were killed. Knowing that 60% of the people that died in El Mozote or that were killed in El Mozote were under the ages of 12. The bullets that killed these individuals, these women, children, and men, had the stamps of made in the USA. The training that was done at the School of the Americas, where this battalion, the Atlacat battalion, was trained. And it was also the battalion that carried out the massacre of the 6 Jesuits in Salina and Elba in 1989 at the UCA. So making sure people understood these relationships between the U.S. and its foreign policy and how they were affecting civilian population was extremely important. Something that, by the way, Monsignor Romero talked about. He sent a letter to President Carter telling him that money that was coming down here was killing his people. And he had no response from Jimmy Carter, but he did get a phone call from the Vatican asking him to stop getting involved in politics. So rather than contact El Salvador, the U.S. contacted the Vatican, and Monsignor Romero got scolded because of that. So making sure that we shed light on all these dynamics that were taking place. And one of the other things that Crispas began to see was this demonstration of solidarity that people of the United States were having by coming down here and literally using their citizenship as currency to protect life. People were coming down here to be human shields. So Crispas became a witness to these two realities, the U.S. foreign policy and then the solidarity that came from the United States. I believe that outpour of solidarity from the people of the United States is one of the most beautiful things that has been done for El Salvador, coming from the U.S. So Crispas has worked around these issues, understanding, after the war in 1992, when the peace accords were signed, understanding that it was naive to believe that a document could bring peace, especially when you had the amnesty law that removed any possibility of peace, of justice or truth to be present. So the foundation of this new El Salvador was very weak, and we understood that the people we had been accompanying, their conditions had not changed. They had not benefited from the fact that there was no longer a war. They weren't afraid of being killed by bullets, but they still had no way to provide for their families. So we continued to accompany them and continue to approach them and allow them to use our platforms and our resources to get the story out. In the 2000s, we had a few events that focused our attention on addressing these issues. We had the dollarization that took place in 2001. We had the free trade agreement. The free trade agreement was kind of like a Walmart on steroids, coming to El Salvador, forcing the equivalent to what we know in the U.S. as mom and pop stores. It did the same thing here to slightly larger companies. So one of the things, and then there were two earthquakes that happened within the same month. So this, along with climate change, has forced people to leave El Salvador. And immigration is something we continue to talk about. Immigration is something that has completely torn apart our social fabric. The war began to do that. Immigration has done that. So we talk about this in a way that humanizes this, that people understand that we're dealing with human beings. And it's sad that we have to acknowledge that we're dealing with human beings, but it's important because if people forget, I think there's a tremendous lack of humanity in the issue of immigration. And where we are today, we continue to talk about immigration and what we try to do is make sure people understand that we cannot look at immigration in a vacuum. We have to look at it in terms of how we got here. The historical component is extremely important, and people need to understand that U.S. foreign policy has been one of the major push factors for people in Central America. So speaking of this responsibly is something that we provide. We provide spaces for people to meet family members who have lost other family members on the way to the United States. We focus a lot on all of those who never made it across the border. There are thousands of people who have disappeared or are dead. So we accompany those efforts in raising awareness around those issues. And finally, I will say that as Salvadorans, we feel it's our duty to share what a war does to a country, in the hopes that people understand the importance of nonviolence in how we carry out actions and how we carry out dialogues. And I think our message has been a little more relevant in these past few years, given the polarization that has existed in the U.S. And the message has been for people to understand that El Salvador went through that process of polarization to the point where tolerance was thrown out the window, and rather than exchange insults, we exchanged bullets. And people need to understand that standing on the fence is not going to solve these issues. People need to get involved, and also people need to understand that the violence and the polarization as it is seen today in your country isn't as bad as it gets. So humanizing all these different issues that have accompanied El Salvador and the U.S., like immigration, climate change is something that is extremely important for us. And talking about the importance of non-violence in how we deal with our issues and how we choose people who value non-violence as a solution. We live in a society that values an army's role in going in to solve problems when it really doesn't. So that's more or less what we do with Crispas, and we do this by connecting people that come to visit El Salvador with individuals who have become activists because they were victims. These aren't people who studied human rights at the university or things like that. These are people who, if lucky, they finished high school, but they do have a tremendous amount of wisdom and experience to share.
If you want to continue the rest of your presentation, because I know it says there's 5 minutes left, but we could go over a bit. But this will be recorded too for those who aren't able to stay to hear the rest of it. Or I'm not sure if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to close with something that I like to share with groups. And you know, we have this notion that that Monsignor Romero was changed by the death of Rutilio Grande, and without a doubt that was a factor. But there were two other factors that pushed him to the point where he finally realized that he had to take a different stand. So I just want to share one of those. One, without a doubt, was the death of Rutilio Grande. But there was another incident that took place only 15 days after he had become Archbishop, and it was a election. And the election at the time was also accompanied by a very clear and clear fraud that took place. Students were protesting and were asking Monsignor Romero, since he had been recently appointed, to accompany them in a plaza where they were protesting. And he received a phone call from one of the organizers and was asked to come and accompany them. He said that he would pray for them, that he couldn't be there with them, but that he would pray for them. And they insisted, and he just kept on saying, "I'll pray for you, I'll pray for you." The following day, there was a massacre, and these students were killed. And Monsignor Romero realized that praying was not enough. And he understood that he had to take on a different role. So this is an event that some people know, but this, along with a few other events, including the death of his friend Rutilio Grande, were extremely important factors that pushed him to take a different stance. And after the death of Rutilio Grande and these events, you see a clear change in how he conducted himself as the Archbishop of San Salvador. So just wanted to share that last thought.
Thank you for speaking, Francisco. We do have a Soup with Substance event tomorrow at 4:30 to 6 o'clock, and that event is titled Anti-Racism in Spiritual Communities. And so I'm going to include the link to sign up for that event in the chat. But unless anyone has any other questions for Francisco, they could stick around. But thank you for coming, everyone, and thank you, Francisco, for speaking.
Yeah, you're welcome.